Hello and welcome to this episode of the Reset Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Mio. This is part of my 29 Days of Magic series where I interview an awesome Black woman every single day for 29 straight days. I am so happy to have Gleana Albritton, who is a storyteller slash producer, on the show today. She has an amazing story, and I can't wait for you to take a listen. Hey Gleana, how are you?
I am great. I'm happy to be here and thank you for inviting me on after years of us stalking each other, or at least on my part, stalking you on social media, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, all the places.
All the places. Talking, and we're always going to call Twitter, not X, because that's just stupid.
Yeah, it's never going to be X for me. I'm sorry.
No, not going to happen. So the podcast, as you know, because you're a proper stalker, first question is always the same, answer is always hilarious. I'm sure yours will be no different. So, what was your first job?
My first job, and this is first ever paid job, was when I was in high school. I worked for a retailer called Montgomery Ward. They were a department store that, like was sort of middle of the road. It wasn't as high end as sort of Dillard's or Macy's, but they were somewhat, I guess, well trafficked when I was there. And I was a floater, worked in the shoe department, worked in like, I think the children's department, like girls' children's and like all the other departments. And that was probably where I learned the value of being kind to people on both sides of retail, both as sort of being kind to the customers, but also on the other side of it, I'm always trying to be kind to the folks who are working in the service and retail industries because people can be kind of rude.
Yes. You're like, what's wrong? Just be nice to people. Like, what? Just common courtesy. I'm always amazed at the lack of
Such a lack of common courtesy. And I think I could not imagine working in retail now. Like when I did it, I think it was like 1994. But yeah, like people are terrible. I'm just gonna say it. And what was interesting about that job was sort of seeing what people would steal. Like people would, I will never forget one of the most horrible moments of my career was I was working in the shoe department that day and somebody like had come in and left their stinky, smelly boots in the box and walked out, I guess, with like a pair of shoes from our department. I've never smelled anything as terrible as that. Even like New York during the summer wasn't as bad as those shoes smell. But yeah, like I learned a lot about human nature and human behavior, I would say, in that job, which I think has served me well over the course of my career.
I was gonna say, like, you learn all about human behavior, how people act, and how they can present themselves, and I feel like that has like translated across the seas right without your journey. So, how did you having this conversation? What was it like having going from Mommy Door to now?
Yeah. So I don't know if I mentioned it, but I actually grew up in a medium-sized city in Georgia, Columbus, Georgia, which people may know if they've watched The Walking Dead. They might have heard of Fort Benning, Georgia, which is now, I think, called Fort Moore. But like shortly after college, which I graduated summer of 2000, I moved to New York because I thought that if I moved to New York, I would get a job at a record label because I had come up to New York for a visit when I was in college, met this wonderful Black lady at Atlantic Records. I think she was in HR. And she was like, oh, if you move up here, because I interviewed for like a PR coordinator position, maybe a PR assistant. And she was like, if you move here, then we'll absolutely be able to get you a job. And so, of course, I'm like, okay, I'm going to move. Like my options were potentially moving to Dallas, Texas to work for a company that like contracted and did displays at Home Depot, which didn't sound as sexy as working in music. And so I was like, okay. And I moved and I didn't know any better. I didn't know that that was complete, a line from that lady. And maybe, maybe it wasn't. Maybe at the time she really meant, if I moved up. But needless to say, moved up, could never get back in touch with her. And so I proceeded to like hustle. I temped, I slept on the floor. Me and a friend from college like moved together. I slept on the floor. We both slept on this air mattress that like stopped blowing up after like a couple of weeks on it. So we were really sleeping on the floor in the living room of this um two-bedroom. I want to say it was like a two-bedroom apartment with like six of us adults living in it and like two babies. It was the real New York struggle story, and I haven't thought about this in years. But needless to say, I got like sort of a long-term temp position at this company called Next Venue, which was in that day like early 2000. It was a company that did like live streaming, but they didn't call it live streaming at that time. And they did it mainly for shareholder presentations. And so my job there was QCing. Like I would QC the video, and like that taught me like a lot of attention to detail and like paying attention to like how things looked and whether like the copy that was supposed to be on screen was correct. And I did that for like 6 months, and I did it at this weird shift of like, I want to say I worked from like 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. And so they would give me like a car service. And so I finally got my big break by taking the car service. And one night, like the car service driver, Tony, was like, well, I know a couple of people who work in music because I've never been shy about telling people what I need and what I'm interested in. And I think that has served me well. I don't always do it, like you do it at the right time, but I've always been a fan of you don't ask, you don't get. Closed mouths don't get fed. Like that's another way of saying it. And so I called, I think he gave me like 3 names and numbers. Tony, thank you, Tony, if you're still living. And one of them, Latanya Martin, worked at Def Jam in the PR department. And she was like, well, I don't have a full-time job for you, but if you come and intern for me, then you will, we'll see what can happen. Like I interned here and I got my job full time. And so Tanya met with me. She brought me on. It was an unpaid internship. I was a college graduate, but I learned so much about how like work ethic, attention to detail, like just networking, hustling through working at Def Jam as an intern. And I finally got like a full-time job eventually. But the one thing that I will say that I learned, because that was during the time that Kevin Liles and Leor Cohen and all of them were sort of in power. Jim Caparo, I think, was the chairman when I first started. Kevin Liles started as an intern. And so like everybody used to, like it was lore. Everybody would be like, Kevin, started as an intern, and his big thing is like, make it happen, make it happen. And so that was what I learned from working at Def Jam. And I've taken that with me to every place that I've worked since then. And so Def Jam, I worked as like a marketing assistant for Island Records, and then moved into like a tour marketing manager role where I did like tickets, and like that was the one of the hardest jobs I've ever had. But it put me in touch with, like, it gave me high visibility in terms of all of the execs knew who I was on both labels. So it was Island Records and Def Jam, and like American, which was Rick Rubin's thing at the time. Like all of these executives knew who I was because I was in charge of like the tickets, and it was stressful, but I learned a lot again about like customer service and like, knowing who the players are, and like really forming important relationships there. And then I left at the end of 2003. And then I did my own thing for a while. And one of the things like I said, that I learned at Def Jam was sort of the hustle mentality. Like, you always had a side hustle. Everybody had a side hustle. And I tried to flip that side hustle into like a full-time thing. And so I was doing some like sponsorship sales and like trying to do event marketing, and really at that time kind of learned that I needed to learn a little bit more. And so I had a roommate that I had for a while. She moved back to Georgia, and I really, really, really tried my darndest to remain sort of full time for as long as I could. But then I was like, you know what? I don't want another roommate. So I'm gonna like take some temp jobs. And so I took temp jobs. I worked at USA Today Weekend for a little bit. And then finally a temp job opened up at A&E. And at that time, they were kind of known as arts and entertainment television, but they were transitioning into like reality TV. And then while I was there, eventually they transitioned into scripted. So at that job, I had a really great opportunity to work as a coordinator for consumer marketing and promotions and events. And I did some CRM, and like I kind of learned a lot, learned at that job all about like how contracts for partnerships and sponsorships are structured. And I sort of saw how much I was undercharging when I was doing it on my own. And so at that point, I was like, oh, okay, that's why I took this job. I needed to learn these elements. And again, kind of learned parts of the business that I didn't understand, learned quite a bit about TV and how that works. I made some of my like really good friends from that place, and I still keep in touch with a lot of the folks from Fuse. And so while at Fuse, I got promoted to director of events and field marketing. It was great. I got to like go on tour, doing all of these events for like from anything from Warp to like Bonnaroo. I built a barn at one point in my career for Bonnaroo. I think it still may be up. I don't know. I don't think Fuse actually owns it anymore. And then I left Fuse to go to grad school in Belgium. I went to get my MBA in Belgium because a friend of mine was like, you're interested in working internationally. You keep applying for these international jobs, but you're not getting them. Why don't you just try? Like there was this MBA fair that like had all these international schools as well as some of the American schools. And so I was like, okay, why not? And I went, found the school, Lyric Business School, and they, sort of said that they were the Harvard of Belgium, which is not very hard to do given that Belgium is such a small country. But in 2009, I moved to Belgium for a year to go to grad school, and it was life-changing when I was there, sort of feeling like, oh, this is special, this is life-changing. And I can't even explain the impact that living outside of the US had on me. It was amazing to be able to like live in Europe and travel to all these other countries, but also to realize that the grass is not greener. They have racism there too.
Grass, it's just
And like that was sort of a rude awakening to realize, oh, theirs is a different type of racism, but they absolutely have it as well as America. And this was during the time when the second Bush was president, George W. Bush. And I just remember getting a lot of like, questions about that. And one of the things I realized was that almost no matter what country people were from, they almost always knew more about what was happening in America than what I might have known about their country. Like at that time, I didn't know very much about Poland or, like what might be happening there or in Brazil or like wherever everybody else came from. It was really sort of enlightening and eye-opening for me. And even moving to New York did that for me, like moving from Georgia to New York. It opened my eyes to the fact that the world was much larger than just, you know, where I'd grown up and even where I'd gone to college. But yeah, doing that, like going to China, going to Honduras for that time, that was like life changing. And you know, I always tell people if you're considering grad school, you really are paying for your network. And in hindsight, I probably, if I had known that I wanted to be a filmmaker, I probably would have chosen to go to like maybe NYU or UCLA or USC. But the one thing that I would not trade is that experience of just understanding how things work a little bit better. I'm not at any means an expert, but understanding just how things work on a global scale, how pop culture does or doesn't translate from like sitting in rooms with like my classmates from like Indonesia and Chile and like watching a movie like The Hangover and realizing like some of the jokes don't translate. That was like, I think, a really key learning experience for me and a big life affirming experience for me. And then after that, I moved back to the US, moved to Georgia for a while. My mom definitely thought I was arrogant when I came back, had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. Although I will say, I think moving abroad gave me a confidence that I didn't have before. And then I got a great opportunity to work for a company that we've already mentioned, Twitter, leading their, it was sort of like ad sales marketing, but for media and entertainment. And so that had like a lot of sub verticals, which is like stuff that I'd already done, which was TV, some publishing, which I had a little bit of experience with, gaming, which was new to me, but like, you know, similar enough, sports. Like it was just a really big job. And they promised that I would be able to like build a team and like do all this great stuff. And then, of course, I get there and they're like, business conditions have changed. And so I did not get to build a team. But, you know, I learned a lot about working at tech and how like very different they are from working in the entertainment space. Even though I worked in media and entertainment, working at Twitter made me realize Twitter is absolutely a technology company. They are not, you know, like I think they, as I was there, started to like move into maybe becoming more content focused and like developing those things and like developing like partnerships with some of the entertainment entities and publishers. But at the time, I really learned a lot about how you have to present yourself, sell yourself through, even though like it wasn't a place that you could like do your work quietly. Like you needed to like shout about your accomplishments, even if they were bullshit. I'm just gonna be quite frank in saying that. And I didn't learn that until way too late. And I will be quite frank in saying that I love Twitter still to this day, even with how certain leadership changes have made it a really difficult place to be. But like Twitter really helped me to see that I could be my authentic self. And that authentic self meant speaking up for what I cared about, speaking up about like issues like racism. Like I love that Twitter made me realize it's okay to be a bit more forthright about like what I care about. And so I left Twitter and 2016. It was 4 days before a pretty momentous election. And I have no regrets about leaving during that time. But it definitely, I would say Twitter is probably made me a bit more radical than I might have been up until that point. And so after leaving in like October of or November, it was like right at the end of October as we headed into the elections in November, I realized that I needed to do something else. I started like talking to people and having informational. I think we met and talked at that time because I was like, oh, I'm kind of interested in becoming a filmmaker. And so I like met with somebody that had worked for James Cameron. I worked for talked to another friend of mine, Claire Chubbuck, who's a filmmaker in her own right now. And she was telling me how you could like make money just on, like on writing sort of the pitches and that type of thing. And so I was like, okay, maybe I'll try it. And like I remember one of the ladies that I met with was like, being a good producer is really like being a great project manager. And I was like, I think I'm a decent project manager. I'll try this. And so I, in 2017, launched my production company, Sisu Media Group, without having gone to film school. I was just like, again,
Okay.
yeah, like didn't go to film school. I'd always been business and marketing. And one of the things that I realized was, hey, there's still more to learn. And so I proceeded to make my own short film first. And I wrote that with somebody that was actually a former Twitter colleague, Jade. And so I made my first short film and I had all these aspirations of getting into Sundance Film Festival. And I was like, this is where it's going to go. My first film out, I made it in like I shot it over Labor Day weekend of 2017. And by like January of 2018, I was doing a screening with like my cast and crew and like had submitted it and got it. Like I didn't get into any film festivals, but one of the things that I will say I'm proud of is that I did screen my film in several places. Like I screened it in LA to a full house, screened it in Atlanta to a full house at Spelman. I screened it in Manchester, UK, screened in Newark. So I don't know. I'm like really proud of that. But one of the things that I learned from becoming sort of this indie filmmaker is that you have to humble yourself. I learned that you really can't control everything. You can control as much as you can. And that was like, that's a thing that I'm still constantly learning is that as a reformed control freak, you cannot control for everything. You can't control, like who's going to support you or not. And like one of the things that I'm really grateful for in that time while in LA and then in moving back to Georgia to be with my family was it took me a minute, but like what I realized over the course of that, like about 5.5, almost 6 years of grinding and working on other people's projects and like working as an assistant director or second AD, being, like working in an accounting department on a film, what I learned is that it is very collaborative. You have to depend on other people if you want it to do well. But I also learned to be a little bit more discerning about the partners that I chose to work with and the projects that I chose to give my time to. And I'm still pretty picky about like what I spend my time on, what I work on, because one of the things that I learned with my project is that if you do not believe in it as the filmmaker, and I absolutely believed in it, and I absolutely like I hustled my butt off for that to like get it made, but like people fall off and people sort of are always sort of looking to see what you will do and to see if you will give up or to see if you are going to make it. There are some lean years for I think almost all filmmakers, unless they are just phenoms, where they're like grinding away and like making relationships and hustling and nobody's cheering them on but themselves. And it's very lonely sometimes, but I'm grateful for that because it really taught me the value of community. It taught me to like really be discerning and be careful about like where I put my focus and my attention. And it taught me to be okay with the seasons where nobody's like cheering you on or paying attention, because that's when you can fail and experiment and learn and really get to know yourself and like know what your boundaries are and know, like know yourself. Like you really truly have to know you and like know what you really want to get out of it. And it sort of changed my definitions and like my ideas about success quite drastically. And I'm grateful for those like times when nobody was looking, nobody was cheering me on. And so that's why I'm a big proponent of what you do here, which is amplifying other people, amplifying other creatives, especially Black women filmmakers, because they're, like we aren't often talked about in the same way that our white male counterparts are. We aren't often selected for those plum opportunities and assignments. And so I think by you offering this platform of a podcast for, like people to just come and talk about their work and talk about what they're doing is really incredible and it's really important. Um, and so to finish up like sort of that arc in my journey, and I know I've been rambling on for a while, I 2 years ago exactly almost moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico to come work for a company called Meow Wolf. And it was sort of a life-changing experience. For those of you who don't know what Meow Wolf is an immersive experiential arts installation, like permanent installations. And so the job at Meow Wolf was for director of production, which was important for me as a part of sort of the pivot that I made from being sort of this marketing executive to like indie filmmaker. Like I felt like the job was really important, like an important marriage of those two worlds for me. I left my role at Meow Wolf in November. And since then, I've been like hustling and working to make the pivot a little bit more complete into scripted, episodic, so like TV, streaming series that are scripted or narrative driven, like not docu style, even though I've worked on some docu style stuff. That's what I'm really focused on now, is like finding opportunities to be the person that helps to produce and greenlight and create TV for folks who, want to see more inclusive stories being told, who want to see people that we don't often see shown on TV and in the media. So I know that's a lot.
Oh no, it's fine. Well, and I mean, you I made it easy for me because like, you've answered all my questions. See, because you've listened to way too many podcasts.
Yeah, I've listened before.
So you knew all the questions already answered. So I'm just going to tell the entire story, which is totally fine. But I think it's so important that people you see that like the road is not as a straight line. It's twisty and funky and weird, and that's cool. But
Yes.
also, like they're so that will make things all good and simple. So I appreciate everything that you were able to share, and the narrative, because actually I think it's important for folks to see that like it can be this and then it can be this for a while and then be that for a while and then come back to this.
Yeah.
That is often not something that people hear, but also it's important for folks to understand that you can get there because you didn't have any formal training in filmmaking and you're like, yeah, I'll figure this out. You did.
Yeah, no formal training and no real connections in the industry. Like I said, I've never been afraid of at least expressing or sharing like what I'm interested in, where I want to go, and like recalibrating that as I get more information, as I learn, as I do more of the jobs. Because one of the things that I've realized, and I tell young people this all the time, is don't be afraid to experiment and learn. A few times I've learned that I put my ladder on the wrong wall, and that wasn't really what I wanted to be doing. And I had to, go back down the ladder and like move the ladder over and put it on a different wall. Like I think there's value in doing that, especially when you're younger. It's hard. I'm 45 now, and there are times when doubt trickles in, and I'm like, oh, what am I doing? Why am I not, like where this other person is? But like that's a noise that I have to be very intentional about tuning out, because I am running my own race, and comparison, it really is the thief of joy. And so I really, really, really have to be intentional and like focused on, okay, what am I learning out of this experience? What am I like what am I like, what's the ultimate goal, and like what are the steps that I need to take to get there? And like being really intentional about like making small incremental progress. Sometimes it's big progress, but sometimes it really is just small incremental progress every day towards whatever that goal is. And it really is, like you said, not a straight shot. And it's especially challenging when, yeah, there aren't a lot of people who've pivoted like I did. I think the biggest example that I heard when I first started was Ava DuVernay. Like she started as a publicist and then became a filmmaker. And she's had to build her own thing. Like she's had to build from the ground up. And like that's a thing that people don't realize, is that hard work when nobody's looking is foundational. And those relationships that you build during those times are really incredible and important. And I'm grateful for everybody that has helped and supported along the way and encouraged. Like you have no idea how happy I was to like hear from you for this. Like just those moments of being like seen and encouraged in some way, even if it's like hey, hey sis, I see what you're doing, or hey, like being thought of for opportunity, like all of it is encouragement as far as I'm concerned. And it's essential. It's the fuel that keeps a lot of us going, I would say.
It's necessary, and it is. You never know you're gonna lost somebody and be like, wait, time to give you a couple of flowers. So you have a ton to do. So I have to figure out, what do you do for your self care?
This is the hardest question. Like I heard you asking other people and I was like, oh, what do I do? So my self-care is pretty simple. For me, it really is about making sure that every morning, like I spend a decent amount of time. And by decent, I would say like anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour praying, meditating, like getting my mind right before I start the day. And that means I get up pretty early. Like I'm like a little senior citizen. I do tend to go to bed early, and I wake up early with no alarm. Like today was really early, but like most mornings it's like 6:30. I'm up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I try to be like make sure that I have that time to just like pray, meditate. Like I read the Bible. Not everybody does that, but like I might do my little devotional. The other thing that I do is reading. So I've been reading books by Ross Gay lately. The latest one is a book of essays called The Book of Delights. And I read that. I may read other stuff for like I may be reading like a bunch of different things at a time, but like reading those little moments of delight. And he has another book called Inciting Joy that I read for a while. Like every essay just sort of gives me reason to like hope and keep going and find like like find things to be grateful for, find things to delight in. So I'm really intentional about that. And then when I have money, I travel. I'll do a spa day or go get my nails done or like, like that type of thing. And then even today, like it was sort of a gray day earlier here, and that's somewhat unusual for New Mexico. Like most of the time it's beautiful and sunny, even if it's really cold out. But the day started kind of gloomy. So like even in terms of what I wear, like I put on like a really brightly multicolored shirt to kind of cheer me up. Like what I wear really has an impact on like my mental health and like how I'm feeling. And so I'm really, 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 really intentional about that and intentional about like tuning out the noise. So sometimes I'll take social media breaks or, like if there are people who are a little bit on the negative side, that stuff, moods are like viruses. They are incredibly transmissive. I don't know if that's the right word. But I'm very careful about like who I'm talking to and what, like what I am ingesting. And sometimes there are things that I won't watch as much as I love TV and whatnot. If I'm not in the right headspace for it, I won't watch it just because
Yeah.
I have to be careful about that.
Yeah, that's definitely too much that out because otherwise it just make you feel worse. Last
Yeah.
question. Do you have a give or an ask for the audience?
Give. Yeah, I heard this question asked on many of your other podcasts. I would say the ask is just remember to support your friends or people that you know that are artists in some way. Like encourage them, send them a note, send them a text, like their stuff, buy it if you can. If you have the extra change in your purse and they're crowdfunding for their project, do that. Like that, I think is the ask. And the give is just remember to love yourselves. Like that's what I've been really focused on, and to really like give yourself the runway to like allow and be intentional about inviting joy into your life. Because I don't know, that's been like really a huge part of how I keep going during the tough times. So I don't know if that answers the questions, but
It does. It's amazing. And you've been awesome. Like I just love that you just you're a wonderful storyteller. And I think this was just a beautiful story about how you got to be where you are. And I love listening to it. So I was like, oh great, this is awesome. But I'm so glad you found that you on the podcast. We'll put all the details in the show notes for folks to connect with you, as well as your awesome book recommendations. And again, I am so thrilled to have had you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining.
thank you for creating this space for us. Like I cannot say how important you are. Protect Laura at all costs, y'all. She's amazing and she's doing amazing work. And I just want to encourage you to keep that up. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And that is our show.